World War I. Around the turn of the century, many European nations were actively involved in imperialism, or the practice of colonizing weaker countries in other parts of the world. Many Americans believe that we too should be following that path. First, I'm going to consider some of the arguments in favor of imperialism. One is the matter of defense. The argument went that the more control we have over other parts of the world, the more opportunities we'll have to establish naval bases. In the event of an attack somewhere around the globe, we'll be in a better position to defend ourselves. There is also the matter of prestige. You've probably heard the saying, keeping up with the Joneses. The neighbors are doing it, so why shouldn't we? When we looked at European nations who were actively involved in building up empires, many feared that we would get behind if we didn't play the same game. Of course, there was also the opportunity to make money out of imperialism, not only by taking advantage of the natural resources in colonies, but also by using the people of those colonies as a market to sell American-made goods. All of these reasons fall under the category of opportunity, seeing opportunity to do something for ourselves. There was also the duty argument, looking at imperialism as something that we had a duty to do out of a sense of mission for helping other people. This argument could be applied to sending missionaries to Christianize other parts of the world, but it wasn't simply about religion. Some advocates of imperialism argued that other peoples of the world, we'll look at the Philippines as an example later on, were in different ways inferior to white Americans, whether it be religious background, the color of their skin, their intellect, or even the government that they were used to. They had not been used to exercising democracy. The mission or duty argument argued that we had a duty to uplift people who were not as well off as we. How did America get involved in imperialism? With all these reasons to consider in place, let's think about how we took the opportunity to do just that. In the 1890s, the people of Cuba rose up against the Spanish. Cuba was a part of the Spanish Empire until that time. In this Cuban Revolution, many Americans were sympathetic. They were cheering for the Cubans, hoping that they would win their war for independence. At first, at least, the United States was not actively getting involved in helping them win. Yellow journalism was doing its part to try to sway public opinion and American leaders towards helping the Cubans. It wasn't until 1898 when we did officially join the war on the side of Cuba, when the Maine mysteriously blew up in Havana Harbor. In hindsight, it appears that this was likely an accidental explosion. At the time that it happened, the yellow journalism was quickly reporting it as an intentional attack by the Spanish and used to justify a declaration of war. So the United States entered the war to try to help Cuba win its independence from Spain. This was known as a splendid little war. You don't usually hear wars referred to as splendid little wars, but it was very quickly and easily won. Most of the casualties, as a matter of fact, weren't due to battle wounds, but to disease. This was the War of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders you may have heard of. So far, this doesn't sound like imperialism, does it? We fight alongside the Cubans for their independence, and we do hand over their independence. At the same time, we tack on an amendment to their Constitution, the Platt Amendment, ensuring that we still have some degree of control over Cuba. We'll have a permanent military base, and in the event we feel Cuba is threatened by another nation, we retain the right to step in. The way in which this war, the Spanish-American War, led to our involvement in imperialism is that we acquired the Philippines. In the process of fighting the Spanish over Cuban independence, we ran the Spanish out of the Philippines. Commodore Dewey was successful in doing this. One could argue that the Philippines sort of fell into our laps as an overseas empire. Of course, those Americans who had been looking for an opportunity to practice imperialism already saw this as a golden opportunity. What about the people of the Philippines? How did they feel about being taken over by the United States? Here's a little background information. The Filipino people had been fighting for their independence from the Spanish Empire, just as the Cubans had been doing. We treated the Philippines differently than Cuba. We didn't win the Spanish American War and then congratulate the Filipino people on being liberated. No, instead, we were basically there to replace the Spanish and claim the Philippines as the first piece of our empire. Emilio Aguinaldo was a famous Filipino leader who had been fighting the Spanish for his people's independence, but then he found himself fighting the United States instead. For several long, bloody years, there were many casualties. This was not a splendid little war like the Spanish-American War in Cuba had been. Back home in the United States, there was a raging debate over the status of the Philippines, a debate over annexation, and a debate even about imperialism itself. Many Americans viewed the Filipinos as, quote, little brown brothers. What did they mean by that? Little implies that they were looking down on the Filipino people. Not just little in terms of stature, but brothers as well. This terminology reflects both the duty and opportunity sides of imperialism. The idea that we have a duty, a sense of mission, to uplift our brothers who are less fortunate. But as little implies, there's also some obvious suggestion of inferiority. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, there were all these reasons justifying imperialism and why we should have an empire with colonies like the Philippines. But there was growing opposition to imperialism. Why did people argue? Why were people anti-imperialists? For one thing, what might come to mind first is the simple matter of the injustice, the hypocrisy that the United States, who in the past declared its independence from England and supposedly is the land of the free and the home of the brave, for us to then become colonizers ourselves seemed hypocritical and unjust to take over the Philippines. But not all the anti-imperialists opposed imperialism for this type of reason. Some of them had selfish motives. Just like many imperialists wanted imperialism so they could make money, some opposed imperialism for the same reason. They felt that it would create competition that would hurt their own economic interests. Some anti-imperialists opposed imperialism even for racist reasons, pointing to the debate over the status of the Filipino people. Ask yourself, if we annex the Philippines, what exactly will be the nature of the relationship between the people of that colony and the United States? Will we grant them full citizenship? Will they have the right to vote? There are lots of questions to be worked out. Some anti-imperialists, coming at this from a racist attitude, argued that it would be a mistake to incorporate these people into America in any form. They thought that it was bad enough after the Civil War that rights of citizenship and political rights were granted to the freedmen. Voting rights for free African Americans after the Civil War. They certainly didn't want to see what they saw as a further deterioration of the American people. Due to not only the fighting in the Philippines, heavy fighting, high casualties, and also the division back home over imperialism, after this brief time in the Philippines, we ended up stepping backwards when it came to imperialism. We didn't entirely abandon influence in the rest of the world, but we were more hesitant from this point on about growing an empire. We started gradually handing over more and more autonomy to the Philippines. We'll see more about the status of the Philippines later on. Of course, we remained actively involved around the world, although we shied away from full-blown imperialism. You can read about our involvement in places like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, advocating the open door policy in China, Latin America, the Panama Canal. We certainly weren't going home and shutting ourselves off from the rest of the world. Certainly, full-blown imperialism was fairly short-lived, though, at this time. Speaking of world events, let's now turn to the outbreak of World War I in Europe. How did the conflict begin in Europe in 1914? It began with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, who was heir to the throne in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had extended its control over Serbia, and Serbian nationalists, some of the people of Serbia, opposed this, and a young Serbian assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. An assassination is always a big deal. But you might ask yourself at first, well, how did that spark a world war? One that eventually even the United States was drawn into. You have to understand a system of alliances in Europe. Various nations signed agreements to stand together against common enemies. When this assassination sparked such conflict between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Serbia, people very quickly chose sides. On one hand, you had the Allied powers, consisting of Britain, France, and Russia. On the other hand, the Central Powers, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. Obviously, the Central Powers were on the side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For a while, it was basically a European conflict, and America tried desperately to remain neutral. That doesn't mean that all Americans were neutral in sympathies. Many had British sympathies. We had a common cultural identity with the people of Britain, and we tended to see the Allied powers as those defending the side of freedom and justice. Of course, there were also many German Americans who had just as natural sympathies for the Germans. As propaganda spread about atrocities committed by the Central Powers like Germany, particularly U-boat attacks or submarines, Americans became more and more supportive of the Allied effort to win the war. Still, we officially wanted to maintain a position of neutrality. This position was strained in 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner which was sunk by a U-boat. The Germans claimed that although it was supposedly an innocent passenger liner, it was carrying armaments and was therefore a fair target of war. There were Americans on board the Lusitania. As you might imagine, when we heard that American civilians became casualties in this European war, it strained our position of neutrality. Then in 1917, the position was really strained with the Zimmermann telegram, sometimes called the Zimmermann Note. Germany sent the telegram to the Mexican government, asking the Mexican government to help them in the event that the United States got involved in World War I. Germany was promising Mexico, you help us fight America and we'll make sure you get your territory back that they stole from you. Well, this note was intercepted by the British. As you might imagine, when America found out that Germany and Mexico were plotting against our country, this seemed to be the last straw. Out of self-defense, if nothing else, we felt that there was no alternative to joining World War I on the side of the Allies. Let's talk about the nature of warfare during World War I for a minute. The modern warfare of the time. Technology had changed drastically since, say, the Civil War. If you look at the technology of World War I, obviously there were submarines. I know the first submarine was actually used during the Civil War. You may have heard of the Hunley. But this was very primitive technology compared to what the Germans had developed by World War I. There were airplanes beginning to be used for military purposes and trench warfare. With rapidly changing technology, there was huge potential for heavy casualties. Both sides found themselves digging trenches and spending week after week with very little movement of lines. Soldiers were getting sick and dying in the trenches, even without a military confrontation. One significant turning point in the war occurred in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. This communist takeover of the Russian government led to Russia signing an agreement with the Central Powers and effectively dropping out of the war. As you might imagine, this was a big blow to the Allied powers. Russia was a huge nation and had been key in fighting the Central Powers in Eastern Europe. Once Russia was out of the war, this freed up the Central Powers to focus more resources on Western Europe, England, and France. Thankfully for the Allied cause, the United States was prepared to contribute to the war effort in 1918 and make an important impact. You can read about General Pershing in the American Expeditionary Force. If you look at the number of American casualties in World War I, they were extremely low compared to European casualties. Yet American aid, both economic and military, made a big difference in making an Allied victory possible. The United States was also involved in the war on the home front. American citizens were buying war bonds, cutting back on consumption, and working in war industries to make sure the troops had the supplies they needed to win the war overseas. Finally, let's look at World War I in terms of idealism. President Woodrow Wilson was committed not only to securing an Allied victory, but he wanted to go beyond that and win a lasting peace, not just a temporary victory. Wilson talked about peace without victory. You may have heard the saying, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. I think this is a good way of looking at Wilson's philosophy. Obviously, World War I was like lemons. War can be pretty sour. But how do you make lemonade or something good out of a bad situation? Wilson hoped that World War I would be the war to end all wars. In order to win a peace without victory, he thought that we shouldn't be trying to crush the enemy. Some of the Allies wanted Germany to have to pay heavy reparations for war damages. Wilson thought that we needed to help Germany recuperate from World War I and establish a peace without victory by providing long-term harmony between nations. Wilson advocated 14 points. He had 14 key points he wanted to push in his plan for the post-war world. I'll not require you to know all of those 14 points, but some of them were freedom of the seas, free trade, self-determination, where nations would decide for themselves about the future of their governments. The single most important of Wilson's 14 points was the League of Nations, an international organization where leaders of all the member countries could sit down and talk about their common problems and hopefully avoid future wars. Wilson was successful in that the League of Nations was created, but the United States refused to join. The League of Nations did not last very long without the United States participation. Under leadership of Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, many American leaders opposed joining the League of Nations because of fears that they would be giving up sovereignty. It raised the important question of who has the ultimate sovereignty. If a nation like the U.S. were to join such an organization, if the organization were to make a decision that was in conflict with the will of the United States, would we be required to go along? Just as we considered imperialism in terms of duty and opportunity, what's in it for us and what's in it for other people, I want you to think about American involvement in World War I in a similar way. What's in it for us? Remember that we hesitated to join the war until the Zimmerman Note made us feel threatened, so we acted partly out of self-defense. There were also sympathies for the Allied powers and belief that theirs was the just cause. Certainly there were Americans who were in position to profit from our involvement in the war. So there's both duty and opportunity. In a speech that Woodrow Wilson made in 1916, he talked about combining statesmanship and salesmanship in America's role in the world. He ended this speech by saying, "And with the inspiration of the thought that you are Americans and are meant to carry liberty and justice and the principles of humanity wherever you go, go out and sell goods that will make the world more comfortable and more happy and convert them to the principles of America." As we'll see, World War I didn't prove to be the war that ended all wars. There would, of course, be a World War II. Had it not been for the Second World War, I suppose we would still be calling World War I the Great War. Stay tuned for World War II later on.